They were so interested in becoming Americans that they lived in sod houses for a long time, farmed their 80 acres that they got homestead-wise.
Wherever they had sugar beets in Wyoming, you'll always find large contingent of Germans from Russia.
It wasn't encouraged that we learn German. I mean, my father's first language was German, and it was a liability for him during his life.
I think that there was a forced amnesia, a kind of forced forgetting about the people who got left behind.
I think their hopes were to achieve a successful life for their families.
America is a poem, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson. Just as a poem is made of its syllables, its meter, its rhyme, melodious cadences and rhythms, America is made of its landscapes and peoples. As various immigrant groups came here and gradually sought to make the land theirs, those people changed, and so did the country with them. Immigration implies departure as well as arrival. Transport from one country to another may mean deportation. It inescapably includes exile, whether voluntary or forced, and brings disruption to families in the old country and in the new. Immigrants require courage and fortitude, even when they are weak and poor. Like many others who have come here seeking a land of promise and opportunity, Germans from Russia have suffered and they have prevailed. Since their background and history is as rich in texture as it is in diversity, they serve here as a model of assimilation of other ethnic groups into American society. 5 representative Germans from Russia who have attained success and stability share their insights on the process of becoming American. Arthur Flegel is the founder of the successful furniture business in Menlo Park, California. Deborah Marquardt is a creative writer and professor at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. Al Newharth lives in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and is a journalist and founder of USA Today. Henry Schmick of Cheyenne, Wyoming is a cattle raiser, beet farmer, helicopter mechanic, and member of the National Guard. Brian Schweitzer is a rancher, soil scientist, and governor of the state of Montana.
There's a big debate about immigration again in this country. It's nothing new. After the Civil War, we had the Know Nothing Party, and they were dedicated to keeping this country pure. They knew people were going to come here. They just wanted to make sure they were Protestant and white. And each time, we go through the same old rigmarole. We're not sure they're going to change our culture. They have to learn the language. We don't want to bring in their culture here and their language. We want them to be American. Sure. And did you really think they came all the way from China so that they could continue to be Chinese? Were you thinking that? Did you think they got on a boat from Cambodia to come to America because they wanted to make it Cambodia? They come here because this is the land of opportunity.
Germans from Russia acquired their history and cultural patterns from a century of living in Russia. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, 2 great waves of Germans migrated to Russia. The first, in the 1760s, went to areas along the Volga River. The second, in the 1800s, proceeded to areas along the Black Sea. Then, 100 years later, many came to America.
I think it's difficult for Americans to process and really fully understand the multi-migration immigration experience. The idea that these people could have lived as an ethnic minority inside of this huge, powerful country for so long, and sort of be batted around by anyone who was ready to make a land grab.
Why were my people born in Russia, and why didn't they come directly from Germany to the United States? During the time of Napoleon in the German-speaking Alsace and South Germany, that became very oppressive for the Germans. Napoleon was conscripting young men from South Germany, and also the French armies occupied most all of Württemberg and the South German area. When this manifesto came from Alexander I, the grandson of Catherine, who was responsible for developing the Black Sea area, it was like a godsend to these people. They were guaranteed freedom from military, freedom of religion, interest-free loans, guaranteed free land if they would develop it on their own.
German Russians seem to be, in some ways, kind of unlucky people who found themselves on this piece of land that I always say was really good for farming, but was also good for moving armies and things like that. So they always found themselves in those places. For that reason, it's a difficult story to tell.
Gradually, life in Russia became more intolerable for the German colonists.
They were told, look, don't be worried about our legal system versus your legal system. We'll let you continue to be the way you live now. Continue to practice your religion, continue to speak German, continue to put your children in German-speaking schools, and you would never have to serve in the Tsar's army.
They all lived in those original houses. After that first 30 years, about 1800, they had expanded and taken up all the reserved land that the Russians had allotted to them. And so the families couldn't expand anymore. There were 4 generations living in one house. So they were getting pretty crowded.
Land was becoming very scarce and quite expensive. Lincoln had passed the Homestead Act. Word got to him over there, free land available. 80 to 160 acres was an enormous amount of land compared with the small acreages they farmed over there.
The sugar companies were advertising over there of the opportunities to come over here and make money. All of them that came over made real good money. Working in the sugar beet fields, they could bring over, and the entire family was working.
Ironically, our German farmers, before they were dispossessed and dispersed all over, they were exporting wheat. My father used to tell the story about the caravans of wagons they took in the Caucasus from the area where they lived up to the seaport. At the same time, I became well acquainted with the people in Kansas, and I learned the Mennonites had brought that turkey red wheat with them, brought it to Kansas. They were trying to make Kansas into an agricultural state and having a terrible time because the wheat they were bringing out from New England, that is New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, couldn't stand the rigors of the Kansas climate. These Mennonite Germans from Russia planted the turkey red wheat, and it was right at home. And it has since made Kansas and North Dakota and Saskatchewan the breadbasket of the world.
The first generation arriving in the United States continued traditions acquired in the old homeland. And while the Great Plains shared similarities with the Russian steppes, conditions in Kansas differed from those of the Dakotas, just as Nebraska differed from Montana. Vast numbers of Germans from Russia worked in sugar beet fields, while others planted wheat. They were all planters, working and cultivating the soil, some as homesteaders who found that they needed to adjust their lives to new farming practices in an alien environment.
Prairie, prairie, prairie. It was, dang, even the rattlesnakes were skinny in that country. It was tough country. In fact, even today, it's not considered winter wheat country. It's too far north for winter wheat to do so well, so it's more of a spring wheat country. The wind blows like a lot of eastern Montana every day, sometimes from the west, sometimes from the east, sometimes from the north, seldom from the south, but it's blowing almost all of the time. Short grass prairie, a tough go out there. It was a real tough go. There really wasn't information for these homesteaders to choose the best places. They arrived, the guy from the Great Northern Railroad, Jim Hill's landman, would say, well, here's some places that we've identified that would be pretty good farm ground. And you go out there and you kick the dirt, and the dirt looked pretty good there. I'm a soil scientist, so I don't like to use that term dirt, but the soil looked. It was anywhere from a fine sandy loam to a silt loam. It was deep, and so in terms of choosing the soil, great place. In choosing the climate, not so great. But remember, they thought there was going to be irrigation. They were told that this canal was going to be built out of the Milk River and they would deliver irrigation. Now, many of these German Russians came here and they had looked at the map. These were clever people. They had looked at where they lived in Ukraine and followed the latitude over, and boom, they were going to a similar latitude. So they assumed they were going to come here, and of course you grow apples and cherries, maybe even peaches. Corn would be one of the crops that they grow, but even though they were the same latitude, that Black Sea made some big differences, and the climate is much more conducive to growing these crops there in the Ukraine than they ever were in Montana. So they assumed that if they could get water to that dry prairie, that they could grow the same kinds of crops as they could grow in Ukraine with a higher precipitation. Well, they never found out because there never was any canal that came in and they had to make it as dryland farmers.
I don't think anyone's ever written thoroughly enough on the effect that the Homestead Act had on migration patterns and on the quality of life, especially in those early years. You know, you could look at the incidence of alcoholism, the incidence of depression, you know, murder, suicides. I mean, there were some very difficult, violent times. Those early years, there were a lot of violent deaths, and I always think it has something to do with the provision in the Homestead Act that people had to live on the land rather than live in these villages that they were accustomed to, especially when the winters got harsh. I didn't really understand that until I took this research trip in 1998, and I went to the villages around Alsace, the area of Alsace-Lorraine, outside of Strasbourg, and I went to the villages that my family names had emigrated from, and saw that these were these little villages, quite small, and you know, there's a church in the center of the village, there's a graveyard, and then you know, there's the town sort of spread around it, and then there's the farmland around the town. And then when I went a few weeks later, flew to Odessa and went to the Ukraine, to the villages where all of my great-grandparents and my grandfathers all emigrated from, I saw this architectural design, which is the village unit with the farmland on the outside. And these are small villages and they're strung together. So you can see these sort of tree-lined lanes that go maybe a mile or two between the villages. And so I think when they came to the United States, they attempted to repeat this pattern.
Wherever they had sugar beets in Wyoming, you'll always find a large contingent of Germans from Russia. They populated those areas pretty good. Farmers would plant the beets somewhere around early May, late April. Beets have to have a very well-prepared bed. And so you plow, disc, and harrow and float. They kept those fields very clean. This is a beet knife they used to top the beets with. When they originally started, they had with horses, they would come through and go through and pull these beets with a one-row puller, and that would just lift the beets up, and they would still be in place, and they would get 4 rows pulled. Then they would go down and they would pull up 2 rows, hit the beets together, and then throw them this way with the beets this way and the top that way. And then they take those 2 rows and do the same thing with the beets pointing this way and the tops that way. And that left an alleyway through here. Then they would run what we called a V, and they would smooth the ground out. Then you went through and you would pick the beet up with a hook on this topping knife and bring it up and hack off the top, throw the beet this way, and then the top just fell to the ground right here. That formed 2 rows, when you got both of them topped, that formed 2 rows of tops, and the sugar beets all in a row there. When they'd done it original first, when everything was horse and hand labor, they would put the beets in a pile, and then they'd come up with the beet forks, load them in the back of the wagon, and then haul them over here to the factory. And then the beet tops would dry out, and we'd come along and load them on a hay rack, take them in and by the corrals, and we'd feed those to the cattle. If you hold it this way and you miss, you had some one-thumb farmers. So, so you always held them like this, and then with the glove and everything on, if you happen to get a little close, well, it would just push it away instead of cutting through your hand.
You kept them knives very sharp.
These were not like this one.
Yeah, they were, because you start swinging that all day, it got tired. The sharper it was, the better it was.
Yeah. Good friend of mine, when we were talking about the beats and everything, he says, yeah, he says, my mother used to have me out at the end of the row. Of course, he was crawling and everything by then. So to make sure that he didn't crawl in an irrigation ditch and drown, they would tie a rope around his waist and to a tree.
Working on the horizontal world got me into research that made me understand how being a woman in agricultural society can be a bit of a trap. That there is a claim that agriculture makes on women's bodies. It has to do with not only the claim of our own labor, but it also has to do with the claim of our other kind of labor, our procreative activity, and the fact that traditionally in agricultural society, women would have a lot of children to create this workforce, then they would have to care for those children. And so I began to analyze my femininity in the context of agriculture in maybe a more mature and more kind of critical way.
Not all of these first-generation immigrants took time to become citizens of the United States. When they homesteaded and received land from the government, citizenship was required. But if they worked for others, became absorbed in city life, or entered the labor force, citizenship was not a priority.
On my mother's side, they got their citizenships just before the 1940s. On my dad's side, they went in and got out the paperwork about 4 or 5 times. In fact, I have some where they'd filled it out. They never did become citizens.
My brother John was also a citizen as a native of Russia, and that disturbed him no end. He wanted to be a native of the United States. In later years, he had my mother create a birth certificate for him, which showed him being born in Cullum, North Dakota. He was only, barely 2 months old when they got here. And so he was really a Culmer. But he did not want to have anything to do with his Russian connection.
They were so interested in becoming Americans that they, lived in sod houses for a long time and farmed their 80 acres that they got homestead-wise because they wanted to become a part of this country and a successful part of it. I never had any question on the part of any of my relatives about whether they loved the Dakotas or the United States. Most of them, I think, had some good memories and some not so good memories of their years in Germany or Russia. But I don't know of any relatives who weren't proud that they were Americans.
As they adjusted to life in a new land, the first generation found that learning a new language often proved difficult.
My mother certainly preferred that. When she was visiting her peers, they spoke German rather than English, because her attitude or her response to that question would have been, well, who do they think they are, trying to speak English when they don't speak so well, when they can express themselves better in German? So they spoke German. But she was not adverse to learning an adequate amount of English so she could converse, which she needed to, with anyone who could not speak German.
My grandmother never learned to speak English. And of course, whatever German I learned was just being around her. And I can tell you that it wasn't encouraged. It wasn't encouraged that we learn German. My father's first language was German, and it was a liability for him during his life. It wasn't a great place to be in Montana during World War I and World War II. We had a Sedition Act in Montana, and it was illegal to even pray in German. And yet, some 40% of Montana in 1916 spoke German as a first language. Almost none of them had come from Germany. And these people, like my grandparents, when they were attacked at a grocery store or someplace because they had a German surname and they spoke with an accent, and who knows what that accent was, because it was, some Russian, some German, some French, and some low German, who knew? But they would say to them, "Do you understand I've never been to Germany? And that my father nor grandfather have ever been to Germany? We don't even know anybody from Germany." Well, that, in times of war, that was way too complicated for people. All they knew is that you had a German name and you sounded like you were German, and so you were suspect. And so we get through World War I, and all through World War I, it was an explanation. We're actually Russian, not German. And then World War II, my father, fought in World War II, but, first language is German, name like Schweitzer. They didn't send him to the front. He was kept back. Well, that was irrational, but that's just the way it was. And so during World War II, we actually came from Russia. We're Americans now, but we came from Russia. We're not German. And then I remember my first day of school, and my mother's Irish, but we have this German name, and she sat me down, and this would have been 61 when I started school, and she sat me down, and times had changed in America by then, and she said, "Brian, when they ask you where your family comes from, don't tell them Russia. Tell them you're German." So it goes. It seemed as though being a German Russian, you had the worst of possibilities during the last 100 years to be an immigrant to a place called Montana.
We spoke German to the parents and English amongst one another. That was just a normal condition. I learned English and German simultaneously because my older siblings were of high school age when I came along in 1917. So it was just normal to speak English with them and German with my parents.
My mother didn't speak English until my brother went to school, and then he taught her English. So at home, it was mostly German that we spoke. My brother and I would speak English to each other, but with our mother, it was primarily German. I still, ich spreche ein bisschen Deutsch now, but I kept up with German, took it again in college. I thought it'd be an easy course. It wasn't, but it was an interesting one.
Depending on how we define the generations, the emigrating generation is sometimes called the first generation. So that generation lives very much between cultures and sometimes doesn't even get the language. In my case, I would say my grandparents, they spoke English very well, but they were really pretty steeped in their first language. And my parents also, although my parents much more fluent, obviously, learned German at home and then learned English in school. So I think as a high school kid, one of my first goals was to shed my accent as thoroughly as I could. And I remember in high school, we could be really brutal with each other. Someone would mispronounce a consonant, say music instead of music. Linguists know those are really common problems that immigrants have with pronunciation.
They spoke German. My mother could read and write German. Her Bible was in German. And then whenever my grandparents were around, they spoke German, although I never did learn German. I could converse with my grandparents very well. They spoke enough English, but they were more comfortable with German. And when we went to church, it was all German up until about 42 or 43. Then they would alternate services, one service in German, the next Sunday was in English. My grandmother, she didn't like it at all when they no longer had German services because she loved the German. My mother loved all the songs in German, but my grandmother just felt that God really only understood German and didn't really get the full meaning in English.
Wherever they lived, Germans from Russia sought to continue their religious traditions.
In Russia, it was expected for everybody to go to church on Sunday. You just went, whether you're in a Catholic community or a Protestant community, everybody went in church. The church was their central activity, the community activity. Everything centered around the church. Religion is definitely the mainstay of society, even though some will claim to be totally irreligious. Some will say it doesn't matter. But without religion, a society will fail. That's my sincere belief.
We would go to church on Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday morning, Sunday noon, and Sunday afternoon. Church service was Sunday morning. The rest of it was brotherhood meetings. Members of the brotherhood would study the Bible, and they never preached or anything, but they would study and they would get together and talk about it and read passages to each other, and they made judgments on their neighbors, on anybody else.
This was a tradition they brought from Ukraine. I don't know if they had insurance companies there or not, but I know they had crop failure. They had hail, nothing like we have in Montana. But the tradition that came was that on Palm Sunday, you took the palms home, and that was before the crops would be up or anything else. Then you would go to the fields, and you'd burn the palms in your fields, and you'd say rosaries. In Montana, in July and August, when those thunder boomers come rolling off of the mountains, and it's a mix of cold and warm air, those clouds will rise 35, 40,000 feet in the air, and they're just rolling, and somebody's getting hailed out. Somebody is getting hailed out. But my parents, like my grandparents, never bought insurance. Never bought insurance. They burned the palms, they said the rosary, and when it was getting close, then they'd get the holy water out, we'd light candles and say rosaries. Now, I don't know if it kept the hail away, but you know, those premiums are about 12 or 13%. And so if you can afford not to give 12 or 13% to somebody who's driving a new car, who has two people that work for them that drive new cars, and there's a regional office in Denver with 14 stories, and everybody in it is making a living off of your 12, 13%, you might make it. And so while I don't know that necessarily the rosaries kept the hail away, it might have kept the 12% in the bank account on the good years.
So were the German Russians economical? Were they frugal? Deborah Marquardt reads a narrative about her grandfather to her mother Gladys, illustrating this very frugality.
Your Grandpa Marquardt, he was a tight son of a gun, you know. Every night he'd come to the bottom of the steps and yell up, "Frank, go to sleep. You're wasting my oil." Because Frank liked to read. He was always reading something. He wasn't much for farm work, but he liked school and reading and just wasting his time on books. So, Grandpa thought, he better put an end to all that laziness and sloth. Frank was pretty much worthless when 5 o'clock chores rolled around. It was more work getting him out of bed than just doing the chores yourself. So this went on for years, this Grandpa coming to the steps at night and yelling up, "Frank, go to sleep. You're wasting my oil." And Frank setting his book down, leaving it open to the last page he was reading, and rolling the wick down into the lamp and dousing the flame. So, finally, Frank gets this town job, and he makes a little bit of money, and the first thing he does is buys himself some oil right off, see? So he can read as late as he pleases. And then when Grandpa comes to the steps at night and yells up, "Frank, go to sleep. You're wasting my oil," Frank gets out of bed and goes to the top of the steps and yells back down, "This is my oil. I bought this oil with my own money, and I will burn this oil however I see fit." But Grandpa, he had a way, you know, of seeing how things broke down, how they divided up. Because he yelled right back, without even thinking, he said, "But what about the wick?" That's right, what about the wick? Your grandfather, I'm telling you, now there was a tight man.
The second generation then combined old world qualities with the new. Now came the tillers, working through new patterns in a new country. For the second generation, the path toward assimilation often led through the opportunity of education or through the choice of a spouse. Sometimes this meant leaving the comfort of their own ethnic group.
We weren't the royalty of Montana by any stretch of the imagination. The first generation were on the edge of disaster every single crop. And my parents, neither one of them having graduated from high school, they were much the same as my grandparents. They kept their heads down. They worked hard. They weren't exactly sure about all the things that were going around, but they knew that they didn't have extra time to go make politics and make discussion. They had work to do.
None of his boys went past the 5th grade. After the 5th grade, they were doing a man's job in the fields. My mother went to the 10th grade. She had the most education in her family. So many kids were out of school in the beet fields that they would have some sessions of school in the summer when they were in between hoeings and thinning, and the schools shifted quite a bit, particularly down in Colorado.
When my father married my mother, an Irish girl, this was not a full-blown scandal, but in those days, you married another German Russian, and sometimes you got a little wild and crazy and married a Lutheran, but for the most part, you married another Catholic. My mother, I think it was traumatic for her because Grandma Schweitzer, as she was called, was always trying to teach my mother the way that they, the cooking of the kucher and the kraut and all of the foods that, the German Russians would eat. And of course, my mother came from an Irish tradition. And so Grandma Schweitzer was never quite sure that my mother got it right. And I think that was some level of frustration.
I think with my grandparents, when they got married, they were distrustful of anybody that was outside their village. On my mother's side, I don't think it was that big of an issue. But on my dad's side, my grandmother, she looked down her nose at people that were not from Grimm. She didn't say that much, but she did. And she didn't trust anybody that was not Lutheran or Reformed, Catholic. She didn't trust them, although 3 of her daughters married Catholics. But she held her tongue. And then the other thing that she had a phobia about was she didn't like used car salesmen. And so one of her daughters married a used car salesman.
As time went on, threads with the old world became more tenuous, sometimes forgotten.
I think that there was a forced amnesia, a kind of forced forgetting about the people who got left behind. And we know now that the people in our small towns were getting letters from people in those villages, in the 20s and into the 30s. They knew about farm collectivization. They knew that our people were losing all their property. They knew that these people were being forcibly conscripted into the military. They knew that, everything. They knew this stuff because they were getting these letters. And I found out that great-grandpa had been getting these letters and that they were in 2 layers. And he said that there was the layer that was written in pen or pencil or whatever it was written in. And then there was the layer in between that was written in milk. And that was the invisible layer. Great-grandfather would sit in front of the window on the stool and hold the letter up to the light and read it and just weep. I mean, the tears coming down just uncontrollably at the news that was in the milk letter, because the milk letter contained all of the bad news about what was happening to people. And we know now that the older generation knew what was going on. My theory is that it became too painful to think about or to talk about. And so we grew up in this odd environment in which German Russianness was all around us. It was on the menus in the local cafe. It was in the speech patterns of our grandparents. It was in the hook sites and the wedding whiskey, and it was in all the recipes. But no one spoke of it.
A love of the land and the urge to farm, plant, and till the soil persist through the generations.
We have our feet firmly on the ground. I'm kind of proud of that. You could take me anywhere in the world, and I could make a go of growing something. And, I know the chemistry and the physics and the biology of growing things, and I like to grow things. I suppose that's a little bit in my blood.
I love to propagate. I love to plant and replant things and see them grow, see them develop. I guess you can take the boy out of the farm, but you can't take the farm out of the boy. And so I love to see anything of that nature, and it gives me great satisfaction and comfort to work among plants. I guess I learned it from my mother, to work in the garden when I was very small, and I may have inherited some of that trait from her because she always had a beautiful flower garden. She would save seeds in little envelopes, little cloth bags that she would make and plant them in the spring, so she always had her flowers.
I have been an annual gardener in, pots, like on the decks of my apartments. I've always had big pots of flowers, and I love growing plants, and I'm sort of really interested in growing orchids, and I'll take the most difficult project on, like trying to keep an orchid alive.
My fondest memories are from South Dakota, from going to grade school there, high school there, going to the University of South Dakota there, working for the AP in Sioux Falls and Pierre. My mom and dad are both buried in a family cemetery in Eureka. I bought a big lot up there. I was able to get a big family lot. And that wedding picture is embossed in a picture that's weatherproof that's on their gravestones. My older brother died at 91 a few weeks ago. His wife, Irene, who was from Alpena, South Dakota, died a few months earlier, and we're having a memorial service for them in Eureka in July, and they'll both be buried in that same cemetery. So will I, ultimately. I've got my gravestone's already there.
By the third generation, the planters and the tillers began to reap the seeds of their harvests. Earlier hopes and fears turned toward strengths and compassion and away from conflict. Men and women together shouldered the challenge of a new life, ready to turn their families into new Americans.
I think their hopes were to achieve a successful life for their families. It's very simple people. They had no great aspirations. If they could acquire some property, they would be very pleased, but they could also be satisfied of just making a living and getting by, because they were from the type of stock that had to work very hard all its life, and that's what they engaged in when they came here.
I think the trait that they brought over that went into all the kids that I know, all my cousins, brothers and sisters, all my relatives, is hard work. They worked extremely hard and were frugal. They hung on to $1 pretty tight. But at the same time, they took care of each other. They were frugal, but yet they were generous.
Well, I think German Russians generally are hardworking, stubborn, very stubborn, pretty tough. As school kids, we realized that all the grown-ups were working pretty hard and that we had to start working as school kids at some point. I think most of them are quite family-oriented and do a lot of things with each other in a family way. I think they're more entrepreneurial. I don't think they would have used this term, but a farmer is an entrepreneur. And I think whether they were farmers or whether they ran a little place in town, that they were more entrepreneurially oriented than they were just working for a salary for somebody else. I certainly think that is something that I inherited and I'm very grateful for.
I would say that is a very German-Russian tendency to diversify in order to survive. And when I began to research my great-grandfather, and I didn't know very much about him, Joseph Marquardt, the wheat king of Logan County, somehow between 1886, when he fled Russia and landed in Dakota Territory, and in the 1930s when he died, he managed to accumulate almost 6,000 acres of land. Well, inevitably you have to say, how did he do that? He had a very entrepreneurial, apparently, spirit. He was a great horse trader. I see this in my brother. He goes around, he sees, oh, somebody's tearing a house down, so he'll say, or a barn, oh, can I have those boards? So he's got this stockpile of basically architectural reclamation, you know, kind of, he's got old doors, and he's got wash tubs, and he's always kind of horse trading, even though what he does for a living now is he's got the farm and then he works for an insurance company. So the question is this genetic?
I don't know that the German Russians were pacifists per se, but I think that they'd had a long of experience with the European royalty, who, whenever first cousin got mad at a second cousin or whatever, and one was a king and one was a duke someplace else, they'd go round up some of the people living on the land and put them in their army and have to fight their first cousins. And so they were literally the pawns on a chessboard. And so when they went to Ukraine, and the agreement was they'd never have to send their sons to fight, that was important to them. I know that my father went to World War II. I believe he was drafted. He never thought much of war, my father. He hoped that none of us would ever have to fight a war. And I don't think that was just my father. I think that was a German-Russian tradition. Now, many of us have, and I've got first cousins who were ace fighter pilots in Vietnam, and we have many that are well decorated.
I've always had a different interpretation of what it means to be a woman in the culture that I came from. Because I would say that women in German-Russian culture are very powerful. My mom, I think, is the real heroine because she's the one who saved us. My dad was the dreamer. We're going to go back and save this family farm, and this is important. And yeah, it was important, but it was my mother who figured out how to do it. And she not only did all the work out in the fields and worked with the men right beside them as hard as any man did, but she also did all the stuff that involved taking care of us, including sewing our clothes and making our food. And so that's my model. My gender model, I would say, is German-Russian women. When they finally arrived and they got on the land, they saw it, that my grandmother just fell to the ground and said, "It's all earth and sky." And that this was not a good thing. Apparently my great-grandfather's response to it was just complete awe, amazement, excitement, just exhilaration at what was there. But great-grandma knew, as most of the German-Russian women knew, that they had to supply all the stuff that was going to go between the earth and the sky. I think in my book I say of potatoes and curtains and pots and pans and bedspreads and quilts and, all of the things that would sustain children, sustain a family.
For some of those who harvested what the first generation planted, entry into a successful career offered the culmination of the assimilation process.
I wanted to get rich and famous, and I had decided in Alpena that the way to do that was to be a lawyer or a doctor, because they had the two biggest houses in town. And so that's what I had in mind. But when I was a senior in high school, I had a wonderful English teacher who was also the journalism advisor for the school paper, the Alpena Echo. His name was Lyman Lexter Bump. Never forgotten him or his name. And because I wasn't good enough to make the sports team, he showed me how I could get on the school bus to go to out-of-town games if I wrote sports for the school paper. So that was a big deal for me, and that's how I started journalism.
I hadn't been in politics, and really I've been interested in it. I was an observer of politics. I had, from time to time, had an interest changing some small state laws or something like that, and so I'd contacted a local legislator, but really had not been involved in politics. And then at some point I decided, well, I think I can do better than they're doing.
My brother-in-law had sold his little restaurant and purchased a used furniture store because no new furniture was available, and it was an opportunity for him. And he was a shrewd person, so he could see the opportunity this provided. He needed someone, though, with some retailing experience, and he was eager to have me come and join him, and we made a go of it. And I was with him for a number of years, actually through the period of time when we went from the smaller store into a larger building, a larger that he was able to have erected. Eventually it became time for me to go into business for myself in Menlo Park. 1954 that was, and it worked out very well. My middle son has taken over the business, carried it forward, and it appears that maybe his son will carry on after that. That means we will have 3 generations. We've been in Menlo Park for just over 50 years now, and if we could make it to 100 years, that would please me. I won't be here to enjoy it, but it would be well to know that it's in that direction.
I decided when I started focusing some of my energy on writing, then I began to see that I was a pretty good writer, it seemed to me. In 1988, my grandmother died, and I think for me that was a big point where I started writing poems about home. I started to write about her and about how she'd be in the kitchen making sauerkraut and the smell of it. And one thing I observed was that people I was in workshops with were so interested in it. And I couldn't figure out why. One assumes that everyone has grown up in the same place as oneself. And so when I started writing about home, that's when I realized, oh, I didn't grow up in the same place that everyone else grew up in. And so that's when I started to transition to writing, taking creative writing classes. I got a degree from Moorhead State, an advanced degree, a master's in liberal arts, and did a creative thesis. And then I started submitting my work to journals and getting published. Some of the pieces started winning national prizes. This was all a surprise to me.
When we started USA Today, we moved the Gannett headquarters to Washington, D.C. Gannett was a big company, had over 80 dailies in 32 states, and the newspaper business was doing okay, but not great. And we concluded that a general interest national paper, if it was kind of jazzy, colorful, might work. It was different, and it was criticized and ridiculed. Most of the media critics called us McPaper, the fast food of journalism. I remember our staff members were very upset about that. So I had a meeting with them and told them I thought it was a great compliment, because if they looked at what other papers were doing, they were calling us McPaper, but stealing our McNuggets. And I thought that was a pretty good sign.
While something is gained in the assimilation process, something is also lost. Something evolves, and the urge to accommodate what is inherited from both cultures challenges newer generations to seek their own destiny, their own version of this America.
What is the sound of a pilgrim soul singing? As a child growing up in North Dakota, I felt myself wanting to grow tall and wild. When you're young, it's natural to be green and vivid. But I heard cautions all around me. You're not so hot. Don't get too big for your britches. How to find sustenance and nurture oneself to maturity in a place that yields only 16 inches of precipitation a year. Like the grasses and crops around us, we lived on the narrow margin of life. If I were a flower, I thought, I would want to be a hollyhock, a tall, sturdy stalk opening large flowers everywhere, or a tiger lily, orange and black petals opening shamelessly to the world. I dared to imagine myself in full blossom. I could be the pampered rose, unbridled beauty accompanied by thorns, or the hothouse orchid, a fragile thing that everyone fusses over. Even in this dry place, I told myself, I must find a way to bloom. I must never allow myself to be blighted. I have a line in my book where I say we were programmed for flight. There were about 6 of us, all these girls who lived on farms, some of them cousins of mine. Not one of us stayed. Not one of us stayed in my hometown, Napoleon. Not one of us stayed with the land. Not one of us became farmers' wives or farmers. Why is there such a high incidence of this leaving, this out-migration?
First generation, they weren't sure how long this would last. because they had moved from place to place and always on the edge of that particular society. And when they arrived here, it isn't that they didn't consider themselves American. It's that they weren't sure how long this experiment would last. And you can't blame them, because they had lived on the edge of a culture in Ukraine for 100 years, and it didn't last. And so to be completely bought into a government, not so much. They weren't the ones that were rushing to run for county commissioner or to be involved in politics. Now, the other side of my family, the Irish side, they were involved in politics from the very beginning. When they got off the boat, they were already knew who they were going to vote for president. That was their way. But the German Russians, I think they fundamentally didn't trust government. And usually when government showed up, they came with bad information. And so their best line of defense was to work hard and keep your head down.
Culture is like a moving animal. I mean, it's constantly changing. Language is constantly changing. I think that's one reason why people are fascinated by German-Russian culture, because in some ways it's a kind of fossilized, certainly a fossilized language. The linguists are studying it now because they know we took that language, from 200 years ago and took it to Russia and then brought it here, and they can study it and see. Culture is not static. It's always fluid and changing.
If America is truly a poem, it is a poem written by the many poets among us. Through the process of assimilation, we blend and mix the charm of all our cadences, our rhythms, even our occasional discords, into the perspective of an infinite variety of American life. And while each of us adds to this poem in our own unique manner and style, Germans from Russia contribute a singular stanza to this common chorus. These representatives then echo the richness and the strength of our American texture and diversity.
Napoleon, has Napoleon been assimilated, or is it like the land that time forgot? On the surface, it has been assimilated to a certain degree, television in every room, cable, internet. The way that it still maintains ethnicity is in the language. Like if you go to my hometown, you will hear people, still to this day, who will lapse into German. And it's not, they're fluent English speakers. And probably if there's someone from the outside around, they probably won't lapse into German. But if you're at a little gathering, a little coffee klatsch or something, you'll hear it. It's in the food. Knipfel soup is still on the menu at the local cafe.
This country can absorb an awful lot of people with exceptional capabilities. Assimilation is a huge question that can't be answered very simply in one or two words, because it depends so much on the culture, the background, as well as the personalities of the people you're dealing with. Some people, personality will allow them. They're gregarious, they're outgoing, they'll engage you in conversation even though they can't speak well. Other people are a little bit timid about it because they're afraid to expose themselves. So you might say they're standoffish when they're really not. It's just because they're afraid. So it takes a while for people to become totally assimilated, some longer, some less.
I think that this country was built by immigrants. And I think we should recognize that and be proud of it. And I think now as then, legal immigrants who want a better future in this country, no matter where they're from, should be encouraged. That has happened from the beginning of this country, and I think it's as important now as it was then. And I think that has made for a richer, more diverse country with more opportunities for everybody.
While that first generation may not learn to speak English, my grandmother didn't, you can bet that the next generation not only speaks English, but they'll have the combination of that hard work and that desire and that drive, and they'll have English skills. Many of them will be university graduates, but get out of the way for that third generation, because that third generation will be the ones who are elected president of the United States, who will be the presidents of the corporations. It'll be the third generation that will get the PhDs. It'll be the third generation that will be the leaders, whether it be in the religious world or the political world or in the business world. So first generation, you bet. They're probably going to live next to each other, and they're still going to pray the same way and eat the same way as they did where they came from, but they want their children to be American. Number one, they want their children to be American. More than anything, when they pray at night, however they pray, they say, I just want my daughter to be American. And so that next generation has a little of the old and a little of the new, but by the time you get to the next generation, whatever the blend they have, they are the ones that will be the tigers of their world. And so bring on the best of the world, and it'll continue to make America the strongest country in the world.
To order your copy of It's All Earth and Sky on DVD, call 1-800-359-6900 or visit www.prairiepublic.org.